On the afternoon of February 18, 2001, FBI Special Agent Robert Philip Hansen drove his dark blue Ford Taurus into Foxstone Park, a wooded recreation area in Vienna, Virginia, approximately 15 miles west of Washington, D.C. The weather that day was cold and overcast, with temperatures in the low 40s and a persistent wind that made it feel considerably colder. Hansen, 56 years old, had been an FBI agent for 25 years. He was wearing a dark overcoat over his business suit, and he carried a large black garbage bag in one hand as he exited his vehicle and began walking along one of the park's trails. What Hansen did not know was that more than 24 FBI agents and surveillance specialists were positioned throughout the park, watching his every movement. Some were hidden in the woods with cameras equipped with telephoto lenses. Others were positioned in vehicles at various access points to the park. A tactical arrest team waited in concealment approximately 100 yards from where Hansen's car was parked. The surveillance operation, given the code name Gray Day, had been years in planning and represented one of the most sensitive counterintelligence investigations in FBI history because the target of the investigation was one of their own. Robert Hansen walked approximately 150 yards along the trail until he reached a small wooden footbridge that crossed a drainage creek. The bridge was partially concealed by trees and brush, making it difficult to observe from the main trail or the park's parking areas. Hansen stopped at the bridge and looked around, a gesture that appeared to be checking whether anyone was watching. Then he reached into the garbage bag and withdrew what appeared to be a package wrapped in plastic. He knelt down at the base of the bridge's support structure and placed the package in a concealed location beneath the bridge where it would not be visible to casual passers-by, but could be retrieved by someone who knew where to look. The package contained 7 classified documents that Hansen had removed from FBI files over the previous weeks. These documents included information about ongoing counterintelligence investigations, the identities of FBI sources within Russian intelligence, and technical details about U.S. intelligence collection methods. The information was so sensitive that its compromise would endanger lives, compromise operations, and provide Russia with detailed knowledge of what the FBI knew about Russian intelligence activities in the United States. Hansen stood, placed the empty garbage bag back over his shoulder, and began walking back toward his vehicle. He had traveled approximately 20 yards when FBI agents emerged from concealment and surrounded him. Special Agent James O'Connor, who led the arrest team, approached Hansen with his weapon drawn and his FBI credentials clearly displayed. According to the arrest report, O'Connor identified himself and informed Hansen that he was under arrest for espionage. Hansen's reaction, as described by multiple agents who witnessed the arrest, was one of resignation rather than surprise. He did not attempt to flee or resist. He did not ask what the charges were or demand to see a warrant. Instead, according to O'Connor's report, Hansen looked at the agents surrounding him and said quietly, "What took you so long? Before we continue with how a fingerprint in a purchased Russian intelligence file unraveled 22 years of betrayal, if you're interested in the documented truth behind Cold War espionage cases and the real human cost of intelligence operations, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these meticulously researched stories every week." Now, let's understand who Robert Hansen was and how he became the most damaging spy in FBI history. To understand how a 56-year-old FBI counterintelligence agent came to be arrested by his own colleagues in a suburban park, it is necessary to go back to the beginning. Robert Philip Hansen had been born on April 18, 1944, in Chicago, Illinois. His father, Howard Hansen, was a Chicago police officer who had served in the Navy during World War II. His mother, Vivian, was a homemaker. According to later interviews with family members and childhood acquaintances, Robert's relationship with his father was complicated and often difficult. Howard Hansen was described as strict, demanding, and emotionally distant. He held high expectations for his son and responded to perceived failures with criticism and punishment rather than encouragement. This difficult paternal relationship would later be cited by psychologists as a potential factor in Robert's development of the resentment and need for validation that may have contributed to his eventual betrayal. Robert attended public schools in Chicago and was described by teachers as intellectually gifted but socially awkward. He had few friends and spent much of his time alone, reading or working on amateur radio equipment, a hobby that would later prove relevant to his espionage activities. He excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and science, and graduated from William Howard Taft High School in 1962, near the top of his class. Hansen enrolled at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, where he majored in chemistry. He graduated in 1966 with a Bachelor of Arts degree and immediately enrolled in a dental program at Northwestern University. However, after 3 years, he left the dental program without completing his degree, later stating that he found dentistry uninteresting and unfulfilling. In 1971, he enrolled at Northwestern's Business School and completed an MBA in Accounting and Information Systems in 1976. During his time at Northwestern in 1968, Hansen met Bernadette Walk, known as Bonnie, a young woman who had grown up in a devout Catholic family. Bonnie's father, Dr. Leroy Walk, was a professor of psychology and a prominent member of the conservative Catholic organization Opus Dei. Robert and Bonnie began dating, and their relationship developed quickly. They shared certain religious and political convictions. Both were deeply conservative Catholics who attended traditional Latin Mass and held strong anti-communist views shaped by their understanding of the Cold War ideological struggle. Robert and Bonnie married in August 1968. Over the following years, they would have 6 children, 3 daughters and 3 sons. The family would eventually settle in a large house in the Vienna, Virginia suburbs, not far from where Robert would eventually be arrested. By all external appearances, the Hansen family represented a particular ideal of conservative Catholic family life. Regular church attendance, home life centered around religious observance, children enrolled in Catholic schools, and a father whose career in law enforcement aligned with their values of order, duty, and service. After working briefly as an accountant and then as a Chicago police officer, following in his father's footsteps, Robert Hansen applied to join the FBI in 1976. His application was accepted, and he entered the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, for training. He graduated from the academy in January 1977 and was initially assigned to the FBI's field office in Gary, Indiana, where he worked on white-collar crime and public corruption cases. His assignment to Gary lasted less than 2 years. In 1978, Hansen was transferred to the FBI's New York field office, where he was assigned to a Soviet counterintelligence squad. This assignment was significant because it gave Hansen direct access to some of the FBI's most sensitive intelligence operations against the Soviet Union. His duties included monitoring Soviet diplomats suspected of being intelligence officers, investigating Americans who might be targets for Soviet recruitment, and liaising with the CIA and other intelligence agencies on counterintelligence matters. It was during his assignment in New York that Robert Hansen began his career as a Soviet spy. FBI investigators later determined, based on subsequent evidence and Hansen's own partial admissions, that his espionage activities began sometime in late 1979, less than 2 years after he had joined the FBI. The precise circumstances of Hansen's initial approach to Soviet intelligence remain somewhat unclear because Hansen himself provided contradictory accounts during debriefing sessions after his arrest, and Russian intelligence officials have never publicly confirmed details of their recruitment of him. However, investigators were able to piece together a general outline based on recovered documents, payment records, and communications between Hansen and his handlers. Unlike many espionage cases where the Foreign Intelligence Service makes the initial approach to a potential asset, Hansen appears to have initiated contact himself. According to the FBI's reconstruction of events, sometime in late 1979, Hansen made contact with Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, possibly through a letter or a walk-in approach at their New York office. He indicated that he had access to classified information and was willing to provide it in exchange for money. This approach was both bold and dangerous. Many such contacts were actually sting operations or attempts by FBI counterintelligence to identify Soviet intelligence officers. The fact that Hansen, as an FBI counterintelligence agent, would have been well aware of these risks makes his decision even more remarkable. It suggests either extraordinary confidence in his ability to avoid detection or a reckless disregard for consequences, or perhaps both. The initial information Hansen provided to Soviet intelligence was significant, but not devastating. According to later analysis, he gave the Soviets details about FBI surveillance techniques, information about which Soviet diplomats the FBI believed to be intelligence officers, and general information about FBI counterintelligence priorities. In exchange, he received approximately $20,000 in cash, money he later claimed was compensation for the risks he was taking rather than the primary motivation for his betrayal. What made Hansen particularly valuable to Soviet intelligence was not just the information he could provide, but his position within the FBI's counterintelligence structure. He understood how the FBI investigated Soviet espionage. He knew what techniques were used, what legal authorities existed, what the Bureau's capabilities and limitations were. This meant he could advise Soviet intelligence on how to operate more effectively against FBI surveillance and how to protect their own operations and sources from FBI detection. Hansen's espionage during this initial period, from 1979 to approximately 1981, was conducted with considerable operational security. He never met his Soviet handlers face to face. All communications were conducted through dead drops, concealed locations where Hansen would leave packages of information and later retrieve packages containing money and instructions. He would mark signal sites with chalk or tape to indicate whether he had information to pass or whether he needed to retrieve a package. This method minimized the risk of being photographed or observed meeting with known or suspected Soviet intelligence officers. According to FBI reports, sometime around 1980 or 1981, Hansen's wife Bonnie discovered evidence of his espionage activities. The exact circumstances of her discovery are not entirely clear, but according to later statements she made to FBI investigators and to her spiritual advisor in Opus Dei, she found a large amount of cash hidden in their home, approximately $5,000, which Robert could not adequately explain. When confronted, Hansen eventually admitted that he had been providing information to Soviet intelligence. Bonnie's response to this revelation was shaped by her deep Catholic faith and her relationship with her spiritual advisor, Father Robert Bucciarelli, a priest affiliated with Opus Dei. She consulted with Father Bucciarelli about what to do. According to Bonnie's later statements and Father Bucciarelli's testimony, he advised Bonnie that her first obligation was to her marriage and her family, and that she should insist that Robert stop his activities, confess his sins, and make restitution. Bonnie did confront Robert and demanded that he stop spying, return any money he still had, and donate the rest to charity. She also required that he go to confession. Robert agreed to these conditions. According to both his and Bonnie's later statements, he did confess his espionage to a priest, though not with enough specificity for the priest to understand the full scope of what he had done. And he did donate approximately $10,000 to Mother Teresa's charity. Bonnie believed, or convinced herself to believe, that her husband had stopped his espionage activities and that the matter was resolved through repentance and restitution. What Bonnie did not do was report her husband's espionage to the FBI or to any other law enforcement authority. This decision would later become controversial and would raise difficult questions about complicity, moral responsibility, and the tension between religious obligations and legal duties. Bonnie maintained that she believed Robert had stopped his activities, that her religious advisor had counseled her to protect her marriage and family, and that she could not bring herself to destroy her husband and break up their family by turning him in to authorities. For approximately 4 years, from 1981 to 1985, Hansen appears to have ceased his espionage activities. During this period, he was transferred from the FBI's New York field office to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., where he was assigned to work in the Budget and Finance Division. This was not a counterintelligence position and did not give him access to sensitive operational information. The assignment was, by FBI standards, unglamorous and career-stalling, essentially pushing papers and managing budgets rather than conducting investigations or intelligence operations. During this period, colleagues who worked with Hansen described him as intellectually arrogant, socially difficult, and openly contemptuous of what he viewed as bureaucratic mediocrity around him. He believed himself smarter than his colleagues and supervisors, a personality trait that would both enable his espionage tradecraft and ultimately contribute to his capacity for betrayal. This sense of superiority, combined with resentment at being underappreciated, fit a psychological profile common among individuals who commit espionage: inflated self-regard, feelings of being undervalued, and a capacity for moral rationalization that allowed compartmentalization of the harm caused by their actions. Hansen chafed at the budget and finance assignment, believing it was beneath his abilities and intelligence. In 1985, Hansen was reassigned to the FBI's Soviet Analytical Unit, a position that gave him renewed access to counterintelligence information. The unit was responsible for analyzing intelligence about Soviet operations in the United States and for assessing threats posed by Soviet intelligence services. This meant Hansen once again had access to information about FBI sources within Soviet intelligence, ongoing FBI counterintelligence investigations, and intelligence shared by allied services like the CIA. Within months of receiving this new assignment, Hansen resumed his espionage activities. However, this time he approached not his previous Soviet contacts, but made fresh contact with Soviet intelligence services. The reason for this approach is not entirely clear, but investigators later speculated that Hansen may have believed a fresh start would be safer, or that new handlers would not know about his earlier activities and the circumstances under which he had stopped. The resumption of Hansen's espionage in 1985 coincided with what would later be called the Year of the Spy, a period when several major espionage cases came to light, creating intense anxiety within the U.S. intelligence community about the extent of Soviet penetration. These cases included Aldrich Ames at the CIA, who, like Hansen, would betray Soviet sources to their deaths, Ronald Pelton at the NSA, and John Walker and his family spy ring in the Navy. Ames was arrested in 1994, while Hansen would continue undetected for another 7 years. The damage caused by these individuals, combined with what would later be understood as Hansen's parallel espionage, devastated U.S. intelligence operations against the Soviet Union and led to the execution of several Soviet citizens who had been providing information to the United States. From 1985 onward, Hansen's espionage became both more extensive and more damaging. Unlike his earlier activities, which had focused primarily on FBI methods and operations, he now began providing information that compromised specific human sources, Soviet military and intelligence officers who were secretly cooperating with U.S. intelligence. Between 1985 and 2001, Hansen would compromise at least 3 such sources, all of whom were arrested by Soviet or Russian authorities. 2 were executed. The third received a lengthy prison sentence. The first victim of Hansen's betrayal was Dmitri Polyakov, a Soviet general who had been providing information to U.S. intelligence for nearly 20 years. Polyakov, who had initially made contact with American intelligence officers in 1961, had provided crucial information about Soviet military capabilities, weapons systems, and strategic intentions throughout the 1960s and 1970s. His information had been so valuable that he was codenamed Top Hat by the FBI and considered one of the most important intelligence sources of the Cold War. In 1985, shortly after Hansen resumed his espionage, he provided Soviet intelligence with information that led them to identify Polyakov as a U.S. intelligence source. Polyakov was arrested in 1986 and, after a secret trial, was executed in 1988. At the time of his death, he was 62 years old, a highly decorated general, and, by all accounts, a man who had taken enormous personal risks to provide the United States with information he believed would help prevent nuclear war. His execution was a direct consequence of Hansen's betrayal. The second victim was Sergei Motorin, a KGB officer stationed at the Soviet embassy in Washington who had been recruited by the FBI in 1980. Motorin had provided the FBI with valuable information about KGB operations in the United States, including details about which Soviet diplomats were actually intelligence officers and what their assignments were. Hansen compromised Motorin's identity to Soviet intelligence in 1985. Motorin was recalled to Moscow under a pretext, arrested, tried, and executed in 1987. He was 40 years old and left behind a wife and 2 children who were never told the true circumstances of his death. The third victim was Valery Martynov, another KGB officer at the Soviet embassy in Washington who had been recruited by the FBI. Like Motorin, Martynov had provided information about KGB operations and personnel. Hansen compromised Martynov in 1985. Martynov was also recalled to Moscow, arrested, tried, and executed in 1987. He was 38 years old. These 3 men, Polyakov, Motorin, and Martynov, were not abstractions or intelligence assets. They were human beings with families, lives, motivations, and consequences. They had chosen, for various reasons, to provide information to U.S. intelligence. Perhaps they believed they were serving peace, or perhaps they were motivated by ideology, money, or personal grievances. Whatever their motivations, they had trusted that the United States would protect their identities and their lives. That trust was betrayed by Robert Hansen, an FBI counterintelligence agent who was supposed to be protecting exactly these kinds of sources. The damage Hansen caused extended beyond these 3 individuals. The FBI later determined that his espionage had compromised multiple ongoing counterintelligence investigations, had revealed FBI surveillance techniques that forced the Bureau to change its methods at great cost, and had provided Soviet and later Russian intelligence with such detailed information about FBI operations that they could more effectively recruit American sources and protect their own operations from detection. Throughout this period, from 1985 through 2001, Hansen maintained his cover as a dedicated FBI agent and devout Catholic family man. He continued to work in various positions at FBI headquarters, including assignments to the Soviet Analytical Unit, the National Security Threat List Unit, and eventually to the State Department's Office of Foreign Missions, where he served as the FBI's liaison for dealing with foreign diplomatic personnel, a position that gave him access to information about intelligence activities conducted under diplomatic cover. At home, Hansen and his wife Bonnie raised their children in what appeared to be a stable, religiously observant household. The family attended daily Mass at St. Catherine of Siena Catholic Church in Great Falls, Virginia. Hansen was active in Opus Dei, the conservative Catholic organization to which his wife's family belonged. He was known to his neighbors and church community as quiet, intelligent, and deeply religious, someone who took his faith seriously and who seemed to embody traditional Catholic values of family, duty, and service. This dual existence, FBI, counterintelligence agent by day, devoted Catholic father in the evenings and weekends, Soviet and Russian spy in the hidden spaces between, was sustained through careful compartmentalization and through Hansen's confidence in his own superior intelligence. He believed he was smarter than his colleagues, more careful than other spies who had been caught, and capable of maintaining operational security that would prevent his detection. Hansen's tradecraft was indeed sophisticated. He never met his handlers face-to-face after his initial contact. All communication was conducted through the dead drop system he had established, packages left at concealed locations in parks and wooded areas throughout the Washington suburbs, signals made with chalk marks or tape to coordinate exchanges. He never used his real name in communications with Soviet or Russian intelligence, instead adopting the alias Ramon Garcia for most of his espionage career. He was also careful about money. The payments he received from Soviet and later Russian intelligence were substantial, eventually totaling approximately $1.4 million in cash and diamonds over the course of his espionage career. However, he did not spend this money in ways that would attract attention or raise questions about his lifestyle. The Hansen family lived comfortably, but not extravagantly. Their house, while large, was not unusual for an FBI agent of Hansen's seniority. They did not take expensive vacations, drive luxury cars, or otherwise live beyond what would be expected on an FBI salary, supplemented by his wife's part-time income from teaching. Much of the money Hansen received from his espionage was simply kept in cash, hidden in various locations in his house or stored in safe deposit boxes. Some of it he used to pay for his children's Catholic school tuition and college expenses. Some was donated to Catholic charities, an ironic form of money laundering that allowed him to dispose of espionage proceeds while maintaining his image as a generous and religious man. Despite his careful tradecraft, there were warning signs over the years that should have led to Hansen's detection long before 2001. Several incidents occurred that, in retrospect, indicated problems with his reliability, judgment, and security. According to later investigations, in 1990, Hansen's brother-in-law, Mark Walk, who was also an FBI agent, became suspicious of Robert's activities and financial situation. Walk noticed that Hansen seemed to have access to more money than his FBI salary would explain. After Bonnie made a casual comment to her brother about Robert having been involved with Russians in the past, Walk became concerned enough to report his suspicions to his supervisor at the FBI's Chicago field office. The information was passed along to FBI headquarters, but was not aggressively investigated. The reasons for this failure are complex: institutional reluctance to investigate one of their own, inadequate follow-up procedures, bureaucratic communication problems, but the result was that a credible tip about Hansen's activities was effectively ignored. In 1992, Hansen was caught by a colleague using a password to access a classified FBI computer system without proper authorization. The colleague, who worked in information security, discovered that Hansen had been accessing case files and databases he had no legitimate reason to be viewing. When confronted, Hansen claimed he was simply testing the system's security and demonstrating that FBI computer security was inadequate. Rather than being investigated for unauthorized access to classified information, Hansen was essentially given a warning and told to stop. The incident was not referred to the FBI's Internal Security Division for a formal investigation. In 1993, Hansen was discovered to have misused FBI surveillance assets for personal purposes. He had employed FBI surveillance equipment to follow and spy on a woman with whom he was having an inappropriate relationship, a subordinate at the FBI who worked in his office. When this misuse was discovered by his supervisors, Hansen was reprimanded, stripped of his security clearances temporarily, and given a poor performance evaluation. However, even this serious breach did not result in a formal security investigation, and his clearances were eventually restored. These incidents represented significant failures in the FBI's internal security procedures and reflected a culture that was insufficiently vigilant about the possibility of insider threats. Each incident individually should have triggered comprehensive security investigations, background checks, polygraph examinations, scrutiny of finances. Collectively, they painted a clear picture of an agent with judgment problems, boundary violations, and suspicious behavior. The investigation that ultimately led to Hansen's exposure began not with the FBI's internal security procedures, but with information purchased from Russian intelligence. In the late 1990s, a former officer of the Soviet and then Russian intelligence services approached U.S. intelligence with an offer to sell information about Russian intelligence operations, including operations targeting the United States. After negotiations, the CIA purchased a substantial file of documents from this source in November 2000. The file contained communications between a Russian intelligence handler and an asset identified only by the cryptonym B. The communications included letters written by the asset to his handlers, instructions from the handlers to the asset, and records of dead drops and payments. The letters, which demonstrated considerable operational sophistication and detailed knowledge of U.S. intelligence operations, made clear that the author was a highly placed American intelligence officer who had been working for Soviet and Russian intelligence for an extended period. The file also included a black plastic garbage bag that had been used to transport materials at one of the dead drops. FBI forensic specialists examining the bag discovered a fingerprint inside it. The fingerprint was run through the FBI's fingerprint database and matched to Robert Hansen. Even with the fingerprint, FBI investigators remained cautious. Fingerprint evidence alone could potentially be explained. Hansen might claim he had handled the bag in some innocent context. What was needed was additional evidence that definitively linked him to the espionage activities described in the file. Moreover, the FBI wanted to catch Hansen in the act of conducting espionage, which would make prosecution easier and would eliminate any possibility of claiming the evidence was planted or misinterpreted. In December 2000, the FBI initiated Operation Grey Day, a comprehensive counterintelligence investigation of Robert Hansen. The operation was extraordinarily sensitive because the target was a senior FBI counterintelligence official who, if he suspected he was under investigation, would immediately recognize the signs of surveillance and would either cease his activities or attempt to flee. To maintain operational security, the investigation was conducted by a small team of agents and specialists from outside the FBI's Washington field office. Many of these personnel were brought in from other field offices and did not know Hansen personally, reducing the risk that he might notice surveillance or overhear conversations about the investigation. The investigation team was compartmented and operated under strict security protocols, with information about the case shared only on a need-to-know basis. A critical element of the investigation strategy was to maintain close surveillance of Hansen without alerting him to the fact that he was being watched. FBI surveillance specialists employed a range of techniques, including physical surveillance by rotating teams of agents, electronic monitoring of his movements through tracking devices placed on his vehicle, and technical surveillance of his computer and communications. The FBI also made a strategic decision to move Hansen into a position where he could be more easily monitored and where his access to sensitive information could be controlled. In January 2001, approximately 1 month into the Gray Day operation, Hansen was reassigned from his position at the State Department to a new position at FBI headquarters. The position, which was described to him as a promotion and an important new responsibility, actually placed him in an office near the office of the investigators who were monitoring him. The assignment also limited his access to the most sensitive current intelligence operations while still maintaining his clearances and his belief that he was trusted by the Bureau. The purchased Russian intelligence file had included details about Hansen's dead drop procedures and signal sites. Investigators studied these carefully to understand his methods and to predict his likely behavior. They identified locations where Hansen had previously conducted operations and placed these locations under surveillance, waiting for any indication that Hansen was planning to conduct another exchange. On February 16, 2001, FBI surveillance detected Hansen accessing classified FBI databases and retrieving printed copies of several highly sensitive documents. These documents included information about ongoing counterintelligence investigations and details about FBI sources within Russian intelligence, exactly the kind of information Hansen had been providing to Russian intelligence throughout his espionage career. On the morning of February 18th, surveillance teams observed Hansen placing items in a black garbage bag in his office. Later that morning, he left FBI headquarters and drove toward Vienna, Virginia. Surveillance teams followed at a distance, communicating via encrypted radio and coordinating their movements to avoid being detected. When Hansen's vehicle turned into Foxstone Park at approximately 3 p.m., the surveillance teams recognized the location as one of the dead drop sites described in the Russian intelligence file. The arrest team was activated and moved into position. The arrest itself was conducted with precision and overwhelming force. More than 20 FBI agents surrounded Hansen as he walked back from the footbridge where he had placed the package containing classified documents. He was given no opportunity to destroy evidence, flee, or injure himself. He was immediately handcuffed, advised of his rights, and transported to a secure FBI facility for processing and initial interrogation. Simultaneous with Hansen's arrest, other FBI agents executed a search warrant at his home in Vienna. Bonnie Hansen was present when agents arrived. According to the lead agent's report, she appeared shocked and distressed when informed of her husband's arrest. She was questioned about her knowledge of his activities, and she made statements that were later used to understand the timeline of his espionage and his personal circumstances. The children, who ranged in age from teenagers to adults by this time, were informed by their mother after agents had left. Their reactions, understandably, were ones of shock, denial, and eventual devastation as the reality of their father's betrayal became clear. The search of the Hansen residence produced significant evidence. Agents found classified documents hidden in various locations throughout the house. They found computer equipment Hansen had used to communicate with Russian intelligence, including a Palm Pilot device that contained encrypted communications. They found cash in multiple hiding places, inside books, in the garage, in the attic, totaling more than $50,000. They found diamonds that had been provided by Russian intelligence as payment. They found the materials Hansen had used to mark signal sites and conduct dead drops. In the days and weeks following his arrest, Robert Hansen was interrogated extensively by FBI agents and Justice Department prosecutors. Unlike many individuals arrested for espionage, Hansen chose to cooperate partially with investigators. His cooperation was motivated not by genuine remorse, but by a calculated decision to protect his family, specifically to ensure that his wife would be able to keep their house and receive a portion of his FBI pension despite his crimes. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty and to allow Bonnie Hansen to retain certain assets. Hansen agreed to plead guilty to 15 counts of espionage and conspiracy. He also agreed to submit to extensive debriefing sessions where he would describe his espionage activities, his motivations, his communications with Russian intelligence, and the information he had compromised. These debriefing sessions, which occurred between March and May 2001, provided investigators with detailed information about Hansen's 22 years of espionage. He described how he had initiated contact with Soviet intelligence in 1979, how he had resumed his activities in 1985, and how he had continued spying even after the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He provided details about his operational methods and the approximately 27 dead drops he had conducted over the course of his espionage career. However, Hansen's cooperation was selective and self-serving. He minimized certain aspects of his betrayal, particularly the human consequences of his actions. He claimed not to have known that the Soviet citizens he betrayed would be executed, despite the fact that as a counterintelligence professional he would have understood exactly what happened to Soviet citizens caught spying for the West. He attempted to portray his motivations as complex and sophisticated, intellectual engagement with the game of intelligence, political and philosophical beliefs, demonstration of his superior abilities, rather than admitting to simpler motivations like greed, ego, and resentment. In July 2001, Robert Hansen appeared in federal district court in Alexandria, Virginia, and formally pleaded guilty to 15 counts of espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage. In his plea agreement, he admitted that he had communicated classified information to agents of the Soviet Union, and subsequently Russia, that he had done so knowing it would harm the United States, and that he had received substantial payments in exchange for this information. The prosecution presented a detailed summary of the damage Hansen's espionage had caused. The compromise of 3 Soviet citizens who were subsequently executed, the betrayal of dozens of classified operations and investigations, the disclosure of technical intelligence collection methods that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to develop and now had to be replaced, and the degradation of U.S. intelligence capabilities against Russia that would take years to rebuild. On May 10, 2002, Judge Claude Hilton sentenced Robert Hansen to life in prison without possibility of parole. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Hilton noted that Hansen had betrayed not just his country, but his colleagues, his profession, and the individuals whose lives he had compromised. He observed that Hansen's actions had been motivated by greed, ego, and a sense of intellectual superiority that had allowed him to rationalize betraying everything he had sworn to protect. The judge rejected any notion that Hansen's actions could be explained or excused by intellectual complexity or ideological conviction, characterizing them instead as simple betrayal committed for personal gain. Hansen was initially incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Allenwood, Pennsylvania, a high-security federal prison. In 2007, he was transferred to ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, where he has remained. A DX Florence houses inmates considered the most dangerous or high risk in the federal prison system, including terrorists, organized crime leaders, and inmates who pose security threats at other institutions. Hansen's placement there reflects the determination that he represents an ongoing security risk, even in custody. The conditions at ADX Florence are extremely restrictive. Inmates are held in solitary confinement for 23 hours per day in small concrete cells measuring approximately 7 by 12 feet. They are allowed 1 hour per day for exercise in a small enclosed area. Contact with other inmates is minimal and highly controlled. Contact with the outside world is limited to rare phone calls and monitored correspondence. Visits are restricted and conducted through glass partitions. The impact of Hansen's betrayal on his family was immediate and devastating. Bonnie Hansen, who had spent more than 30 years married to a man she believed was a devoted Catholic and faithful FBI agent, was forced to confront the reality that her husband had been living a lie for most of their marriage. The psychological trauma of this realization, combined with the public humiliation of having her husband's crimes exposed in detail and her own complex history with his espionage, which she had discovered 2 decades earlier, took an enormous toll. She was questioned repeatedly about what she had known and when she had known it. Her decision not to report her husband's espionage when she discovered it in the early 1980s was scrutinized and criticized, though prosecutors ultimately determined that she had not violated any laws and decided not to pursue charges against her. The financial impact was also severe. Although the plea agreement allowed Bonnie to retain the family home and a portion of Robert's FBI pension, the legal costs of the case and the loss of Robert's income created significant hardship. The house in Vienna, once a symbol of their successful middle-class life, became a place of shame and stigma. Neighbors avoided contact. The family's standing in their Catholic parish and in the Opus Dei community was destroyed. Bonnie eventually sold the house and moved to a smaller residence, seeking privacy and distance from the notoriety. For the Hansen children, 3 daughters and 3 sons, ranging in age from teenagers to adults at the time of their father's arrest, the consequences were profound and lasting. They had grown up believing their father was a heroic FBI agent fighting against America's enemies, a devout Catholic living according to his principles, a stern but loving parent who provided for their material and spiritual needs. The revelation that he had actually been betraying his country for money, that he had been lying to them their entire lives, that everything they believed about him was false, shattered their sense of identity and trust. The oldest children, who were adults with families of their own by 2001, struggled to explain to their own children what their grandfather had done and what that meant for their family. The younger children, still teenagers or in college, faced cruel mockery from peers and the challenge of building lives while carrying the burden of their father's infamy. Several of the children changed their names or moved away from the Washington, D.C. area to escape the association with their father's crimes. According to interviews conducted years later by researchers studying the impact of parental espionage on families, all of the Hansen children experienced depression, anxiety, and difficulty trusting others. Several entered therapy to deal with the trauma. Their relationships with their mother were complicated by questions about what she had known and whether she should have done more to stop their father. Some of the children blamed Bonnie for not reporting Robert's activities in the early 1980s, believing that if she had, the family might have been spared years of living with a lie. Others sympathized with the impossible position she had been in and the manipulation she had experienced from her husband. The broader damage assessment conducted by the FBI and the intelligence community in the aftermath of Hanssen's arrest revealed the extraordinary scope of his betrayal. Over 22 years, he had compromised at least 3 human sources within Soviet and Russian intelligence, 2 of whom were executed and 1 imprisoned. He had compromised more than 50 classified operations and investigations. He had exposed technical intelligence collection programs worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had revealed the identities of numerous FBI and CIA personnel involved in counterintelligence operations. He had provided detailed information about U.S. nuclear war plans and military capabilities. He had disclosed information about FBI surveillance techniques that forced the Bureau to completely revise its methods. The long-term consequences for U.S. intelligence operations were severe. The compromise of sources like Polyakov, Motorin, and Martynov made it far more difficult to recruit new sources within Russian intelligence, as potential sources knew that cooperation with U.S. intelligence had proven fatal to others. The exposure of technical collection methods required massive expenditures to develop new capabilities. The knowledge that someone within the FBI had been compromising operations for more than 2 decades created a climate of suspicion and mistrust that damaged morale and effectiveness. The Hansen case also prompted a comprehensive review of security procedures within the FBI and across the U.S. intelligence community. Investigators examined how Hansen had been able to continue his espionage for so long, despite the warning signs documented earlier, the inadequate follow-up on the 1990 tip from his brother-in-law, the failure to properly investigate the 1992 computer access breach, and the insufficient response to the 1993 surveillance equipment misuse. The review identified numerous systemic failures, inadequate background investigations that failed to detect psychological and behavioral warning signs, insufficient monitoring of employees' access to classified information and computer systems, lack of regular polygraph examinations for employees with access to sensitive information, poor communication between different units and offices that prevented warning signs from being connected and acted upon, a culture that was resistant to the idea that FBI agents themselves could be security threats, and inadequate financial monitoring that failed to detect that Hansen's lifestyle and spending patterns were inconsistent with his official income. In response to these failures, the FBI and other intelligence agencies implemented significant reforms. These included mandatory polygraph examinations every 5 years for employees with access to sensitive information, enhanced financial disclosure requirements and monitoring, improved computer systems that tracked and logged all access to classified databases, random security audits of employees' activities, better integration of security information across agencies, and cultural changes designed to overcome resistance to investigating potential insider threats. However, these reforms came too late for the victims of Hansen's espionage. Dmitri Polyakov had been executed in 1988, 13 years before Hansen's arrest. Sergei Motorin and Valery Martynov had been executed in 1987, 14 years before Hansen was caught. These men had trusted that the United States would protect their identities. That trust was betrayed by an FBI counterintelligence agent who was supposed to be protecting exactly these kinds of sources, and the systems that should have detected that betrayal failed for more than 2 decades. The families of these men, widows, children, siblings, were never able to fully understand what had happened to their loved ones or why. In the Soviet system, the families of executed intelligence officers were typically not informed of the true circumstances of death. They were told their relative had died of natural causes or in an accident, or they simply disappeared without explanation. It was only years later, after the end of the Cold War and the partial opening of Soviet archives, that some of these families learned the truth. By that time, the opportunity to mourn properly, to understand, to seek any kind of closure, had long passed. Robert Hansen's motivations for committing espionage remain somewhat unclear despite his extensive debriefings and despite decades of analysis by intelligence professionals, psychologists, and scholars who have studied his case. The explanations he provided were inconsistent and self-serving. At different times, he claimed his espionage was motivated by intellectual curiosity, political beliefs, need for excitement, resentment toward the FBI, desire to prove his superiority over his colleagues, and financial need. None of these explanations is entirely convincing on its own, and together they suggest that Hansen himself did not fully understand his own motivations, or, more likely, that he was unwilling to acknowledge them honestly even to himself. What does seem clear from the evidence is that Hansen's espionage was motivated by a complex combination of psychological factors: an inflated sense of his own intelligence and capabilities, resentment toward an FBI bureaucracy he felt did not appreciate his talents, need for validation and recognition from someone, even if that someone was an enemy intelligence service, excitement and psychological stimulation from engaging in dangerous activities, contempt for the conventional morality that governed most people's behavior, and a capacity for moral rationalization that allowed him to compartmentalize the harm his actions caused. The financial compensation he received, totaling approximately $1.4 million over 22 years, was substantial but not enormous by espionage standards, and he did not spend it in ways that dramatically improved his lifestyle. This suggests that money was not the primary motivation, though it certainly made the espionage more attractive and provided a rationalization that his betrayal was a form of employment rather than treason. Perhaps most disturbing was Hansen's ability to compartmentalize his espionage from the rest of his life. He was simultaneously a Soviet and Russian spy compromising his country's secrets and an FBI counterintelligence agent investigating Soviet and Russian espionage. He was betraying sources who trusted the FBI to protect them and presenting himself as a dedicated defender of national security. He was professing deep Catholic faith and attending daily Mass while knowingly engaging in actions that resulted in the deaths of human beings. This degree of compartmentalization suggests a personality structure that could separate different aspects of reality and maintain contradictory identities without experiencing the cognitive dissonance that would prevent most people from sustaining such contradictions. In 2021, 20 years after Hansen's arrest, the FBI held a private ceremony at its headquarters to honor the memory of the 3 Soviet sources Hansen had betrayed, men whose photographs were placed in a memorial display case alongside brief descriptions of their service and ultimate sacrifice. The ceremony was attended by FBI personnel involved in counterintelligence operations and by representatives from the intelligence community. It was not attended by members of the victims' families, most of whom still live in Russia and were not informed about the ceremony until afterward. The gesture, while meaningful in acknowledging these men's contributions and sacrifices, came far too late to undo the harm or provide closure to families who lost husbands, fathers, and sons decades earlier. As of January 2025, Robert Hansen remains incarcerated at ADX Florence under the same restrictive conditions imposed since 2007. He is now 80 years old. Bureau of Prisons records indicate declining health, though specific medical conditions are not publicly disclosed. He has served 23 years of his life sentence. He spends his days in the same small concrete cell, isolated from human contact, with no prospect of release or redemption. The life he once had, the career, the family, the standing in his community, the sense of identity and purpose, has been reduced to this: confinement, isolation, monotony, and the knowledge that he destroyed everything he claimed to care about. For his part, Hansen has had minimal contact with his family over the years. His wife Bonnie initially visited him occasionally, but these visits became less frequent over time and eventually ceased altogether. His children's relationships with him were severely damaged by his betrayal, and most have had little or no contact with him since his imprisonment. Bonnie Hansen has maintained almost complete silence about her husband's crimes and about her own experience. She declined requests for interviews. She has given no public statements beyond brief comments through her attorney shortly after Robert's arrest. According to people who know her, she has rebuilt a quiet life, focused on her children and grandchildren, her faith, and maintaining as much privacy as possible. She attends Mass regularly, but no longer participates actively in the Opus Dei community that was once central to her life. She lives modestly on her portion of Robert's FBI pension and works part-time. By all accounts, she carries the burden of her husband's betrayal with dignity, but also with deep pain that will never fully heal. The Hansen children, now middle-aged adults with families of their own, have similarly maintained privacy about their experiences. None have given interviews about their father. None have written memoirs or sought public attention. They appear to have chosen to build their lives separate from their father's infamy, carrying the burden privately rather than publicly. This is perhaps the healthiest response available to them, though it does not erase the damage they experienced. The question of responsibility in the Hansen case is complicated because it requires us to assign blame among different actors and systems. Robert Hansen bears primary responsibility for choosing to commit espionage, for continuing that espionage over 22 years, and for compromising sources whose deaths he had to have known were likely. His responsibility cannot be diminished by pointing to institutional failures, psychological factors, or the complexity of his motivations. He made choices repeatedly over decades, knowing they were wrong and knowing the potential consequences. But the FBI and the broader U.S. intelligence community also bear responsibility for the institutional failures that allowed Hansen's espionage to continue for so long. The warning signs were there: the suspicious behavior, the unauthorized computer access, the misuse of surveillance equipment, the tip from his brother-in-law, the financial anomalies. These warning signs were not properly investigated or acted upon, in part because of institutional resistance to the idea that an FBI counterintelligence agent could be a spy, in part because of inadequate security procedures, and in part because of bureaucratic failures in communication and follow-up. Bonnie Hansen's responsibility is more ambiguous and morally complex. When she discovered her husband's espionage in the early 1980s, she faced an impossible choice: report him to authorities and destroy her family, or try to make him stop and preserve her marriage. She chose the latter, following the advice of her religious counselor, who told her that her primary obligation was to her marriage and family. Whether this choice can be considered morally wrong, legally culpable, or simply understandable human behavior in an impossible situation is a question that admits no simple answer. What is certain is that the human cost of Hansen's espionage extended far beyond the spies and counterintelligence agents who occupy the foreground of the story. Dmitri Polyakov's widow lived for years not knowing why her husband was suddenly arrested and then executed, carrying that mystery and grief in silence under the Soviet system that provided no answers. Sergei Motorin and Valery Martynov's children grew up without their fathers, told lies about how they died, never able to properly mourn or understand. Robert and Bonnie Hansen's 6 children had their family destroyed, their sense of identity shattered, and their futures shaped by trauma they did nothing to cause or deserve. These secondary victims, the families, the children, the widows, bear no responsibility for what happened, yet they suffered consequences that will last their entire lives. A 7-year-old girl in Moscow whose father was arrested in 1987 and never returned carries that absence with her at age 40. A son in Virginia who was 15 when FBI agents arrested his father in 2001 is now approaching 40, still dealing with the psychological aftermath of that trauma. These ripples of damage spread outward through generations, touching people who had no agency in the events that destroyed their families. The photograph that appeared on front pages after Hansen's arrest, his FBI identification photograph from the late 1990s showing a middle-aged man with thinning hair, glasses, and an unremarkable face, captured something essential about the banality of betrayal. Hansen looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, a senior FBI agent, a middle management professional, someone you might see on the metro commuting to work or at church on Sunday. There was nothing in his appearance that suggested what he was actually doing in the hidden spaces of his life. That is perhaps what makes the image most unsettling. The ordinariness of it, the fact that espionage and betrayal can look, in frozen photographic moments, exactly like respectable bureaucratic life. The larger question raised by the Hansen case is how to build systems that can protect against insider threats without creating internal surveillance states that undermine trust and effectiveness. After Hansen's arrest, the FBI and other intelligence agencies implemented enhanced security measures, more polygraph examinations, better financial monitoring, increased computer surveillance, random audits. These measures have costs in terms of employee morale, trust, and privacy. They also have not and cannot eliminate the risk entirely. As long as intelligence organizations require people to handle sensitive information, some of those people will betray that trust. The challenge is to maintain appropriate vigilance without paranoia, to investigate warning signs without destroying innocent careers through unfounded suspicions, to balance security with the operational effectiveness that requires some degree of trust and autonomy. These are not problems that can be solved definitively, but must be managed through constant attention, institutional learning, and willingness to acknowledge and correct failures. Robert Hansen exploited failures in those systems for 22 years. His espionage damaged U.S. national security, cost lives, and destroyed his family. The systems that allowed his espionage to continue for so long were flawed and have since been reformed, though whether those reforms are sufficient remains uncertain. What is certain is that the damage he caused cannot be undone. The dead remain dead. The families remain broken. The trust remains betrayed. Robert Hansen was 35 years old when he first made contact with Soviet intelligence and offered to betray his country. He was 56 when FBI agents arrested him at a dead drop site in a suburban park. He is now 80 years old, having spent perhaps 23 years in isolation, contemplating or avoiding the reality of what he did and what he destroyed. The years between these points were filled with dead drops, encrypted communications, classified documents passed to enemy handlers, payments received, lies told to family and colleagues, sources betrayed, operations compromised, and lives ended. And in a small concrete cell at a maximum security prison in Colorado, an old man spends his days in isolation, having traded everything he claimed to care about for money, ego, and the psychological stimulation of playing a dangerous game he thought he was too smart to lose.